Okay, we are going to next hear from our friend Mike, who is going to talk a little bit about some new stuff that is the haps in Unity. And he's going to talk a little bit about how to add polish to your Unity project with that stuff. Please welcome him. With applause.
Fantastic. All right, so I do want to do one thing real quick. It's not involved in my presentation, but I want to amplify the signal a little bit. Networking is really, really important. I just want to say that every professional development job I've ever gotten has been from networking. So again, really important. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about adding polish to your game, whether that means your prototype that you're just showing off, is it's a game jam, or if it's just something you threw together in 5 minutes just for fun. Polish is one of the first things anyone will see about your game. They're not going to see the months and months of work you put into your really intricate battle system. They're not going to see all the late nights you stayed up. They're going to see the first 5 seconds of polish and what does it look like. Unity has introduced 2 new tools that make this really easy, that in less than an hour, once you've run through it, all of your projects should have this, and it does not take you very long. Those tools are version 2 of the post-processing stack and Cinemachine. For who I am one of the friendly developers over at Helios Interactive. They pay me to make games. So let's get started. To set up your project, there's only 2 things you have to do. For Cinemachine, you go to the asset store, you search for Cinemachine, you install it, you're done. For post-processing stack, because version 2 is so new, you can't pull that from the asset store. Version 1 is what's on the asset store. So you need to go to their GitHub, you need to download it, you need to copy it over to your project. Super easy. So let's get into what you can do with these tools. Before we do that, there's a step 0, and this is included in Unity right now. You need to go change your color space to linear. You need to go do this because gamma is the default, and it is, without going into the details too much, linear will give you a more realistic lighting and coloring scenario to your scene. But you need to do it from the beginning, because if you try and take a project that you've already been working on, you've already been working on the colors and making everything match in the lighting, and you suddenly switch it over to linear, things will look different and it will require a lot of work. So I'm just saying right now, start your project, go switch to linear. One thing, and I don't know how well this will translate, I didn't think about this when I was putting this together, is these will be a lot of before and after shots, and I don't know how well that will translate to this projector. But just to give you a quick example, if you notice in the gamma one here, look at this rock. This is the exact same rock that's over in this over here, but looks completely different. This looks way shinier, the brights are almost blown out. Same with the colors here on this character. And you can adjust things like the shininess or the smoothness of the material. But naturally, linear will just get you to a much better place. So, now that you've done step 1, setting up the post-processing stack, I've included way more details in this slide than what I'm going to talk about, because if you like anything I talk about, I will have a link to the GitHub and this these slides, so you can go look at them later. So don't worry about all this. But the gist of it is, version 2 of the post-processing stack has changed up the way Unity does its post-processing effects. It used to be with version 1, you drop a script on your camera, you would select what effects you want, and you were done. Now with version 2, they've moved to more of an Unreal style of post-processing volumes. So you would set up in your scene trigger spaces. You would have a giant square box, and when the player was inside of that box, they'd see a certain type of effect. This is great because, say you have a scene with a cave, and when they're in the cave, you want it to be dark and gloomy, and the colors kind of wash away. And then as soon as they step outside, the bloom comes in, and everything's bright. This is great. And so it really enables a lot of things, but there's more setup involved. So all you have to do is run through these steps. It's not that scary. Once you've done that, We'll go into what some of these effects are you can start dropping into your scene. The first one, to actually add these effects, it's really simple. You're going to be going to this volume, you're going to add effect, and choosing from Unity's built-in effects, dropping in, telling it what you want to override, and just changing values. This is great because even if you are not a really experienced developer, you can go through and you have all these values that you can kind of fiddle with and change, and in real time see how it changes the look of your scene. So without really knowing what everything is doing, you can dial things in and just really play with the look of your game. I like to just turn everything up to 100, but everyone has their own style. So the first thing that you can add to your scene is ambient occlusion. This is probably the single most effective tool you can drop into your scene to make it look better. But warning, it is also the most computationally expensive. So if you're working on a mobile game or you are in some way resource limited, maybe be careful with it. Just to give you some quick examples, if you look up at the trees on the left, you can tell these are round trees, but until you get over to the right, all of a sudden there's form. You know, there's light being the way it is. Let's actually look at the rocks. See up here. So this area here, and how it's kind of flat, there's not a lot going on. And if you look at the shading, basically this looks at the complexity of your scene, it looks at how many things are close together, and it adds some shading. It is very effective in making your scene look more real. Even when you're doing this low poly kind of aesthetic, it looks more believable. Look around the scene, around the character's neck, lower arm. It's great. And it doesn't take much. You drop this thing in, you change a single slider, and you're done. Next, bloom. Okay, bloom is like the lens flare of the game development world. You can go crazy with it. Be careful. It has a great use, and there's a lot you can do with it, but maybe don't go too crazy. What I've tried to do with this scene here is be very subtle with it. And the only place you're really going to notice it is on the back of the characters where the light is shining off of their heads. And it makes it more believable. I believe that there's a bright sun right behind them shining and doing something. With that said, what makes bloom dangerous is if you're not working in an HDR space. So normally your colors go from 0 to 1. This is LDR. This is just your typical color space. When you put bloom on, you're saying, all right, at 0.9, things need to start glowing. Well, that kind of works until you realize you have a cloud that is pure white and now is glowing like the sun. That doesn't make sense. So you work in HDR. And what is HDR? That is basically just saying my colors can now go from 0 to whatever I decide they go to. So you can have your base colors go from 0 to 1, and you can say anything above 1, I want bloom to start showing up. I use that in this scene here to make it look like there's an asteroid with this really weird glowing core, and the bloom really sells that. You know, there's this red that's coming over and coloring the brown of the asteroid. Without bloom and without HDR, that doesn't sell well. So let's move on. Chromatic aberration. Okay, these next two effects I'm going to talk about are actually imperfections. And that seems weird until you realize we have all spent a lot of time watching TV and watching movies, and we've all become accustomed to the imperfections that come with lenses. Chromatic aberration is one of them. It's around the edges of the scene, and you can actually notice it up in the tree where there's the bright light shining. It's the separation of colors, and it's kind of the bending around the edges. If on one side there'll be some blue coming off and red going the other. Don't know if you guys can see that in this slide, but it is an imperfection. As game developers, we start in this perfect world, and to get real, we have to add imperfections. We work opposite of everyone else. And the other one that does that is vignetting. And you guys can't really see, but vignetting is basically shading around the edges of a scene. It's a circular pattern, and you would really notice it around the corners, and it would be like this black shadow coming in, and you can really crank that up if you want to feel constrained. It's a great thing to use in tight spaces. It makes the player feel claustrophobic. Very useful. Those two things together can make your scene, again, feel real in a subtle way. Don't abuse it. All right, this is the other big one. On top of ambient occlusion, I'd say depth of field is my favorite effect to work with. And again, it's the one you can also go crazy with. In this scene, I've tried to keep it subtle. I've tried to keep everything realistic and what you would actually use in your projects. Unless you're going for something very stylized, you're probably not cranking a lot of these values up. But if you just look at like the clouds and the mountains in the background, they just seem a little out of focus and makes things feel real. If you don't want to just be real, you can also go crazy with it, and you can take that all the way up and just do something like that. A lot of times that's silly, but it has a great effect if you're looking for something like tilt shift and you want things to feel small. You can just do this, you can just go crazy with this. It's fun. It's a lot of fun to work with this one. But what I want to talk about with that is intentionality. Yeah, you can go crazy with it. Just make sure there's a reason why you're doing it. Make sure you've planned to go crazy. Like, I want everything to be blurred out because I want to focus on the character. I want it to be dramatic. Do whatever you want, just do it intentionally. Okay, so that's all the image effects. I just want to quickly show the before and after of just using the post-processing stack, what it can look like. And again, this is a very simple scene. This is, there's no textures, you know, they're just, everything's just colored with blocks, and these are just some low poly models all thrown together. And you can just go from something basic to a much more realistic scene, or you almost feel like you see these characters and you start placing things like, oh, are these little clay guys that are just fighting each other? What's going on? It feels more like a real scene, and it doesn't take long. 15, 20 minutes, you can have this in any game you're working on. So the next big part, Cinemachine. So Cinemachine was an existing technology that Unity has recently bought and included in their setup. So we were just showing static images. I just want to show quickly what the characters are doing. This is with no effects. This is just the characters. We're imagining we're making an RPG game where they're going to run up, they're going to punch each other, and then they very politely run back to the spot. To set this up, all you need to do, assuming you've already added Cinemachine to your project, is go up to the Cinemachine menu and click Add Virtual Camera, and you're done. You now have this much more dynamic camera, which we'll now get into what you can do with that camera. Just as a quick explanation, virtual cameras will take over your main camera. Okay, we're gonna hurry this up real quick. Let's see. The first thing we're gonna do, because Cinemachine is a very powerful tool, but it can take a little getting used to. One of the easiest things you can do with it is tell it to look at something. There's a field, you drop a game object in it, you say, look at this thing. Just by doing that, you get a scene closer to this. Where now when he's running, the camera looks at him. It's like, oh, cool. It feels more dynamic. I've also added some noise, so it looks like someone has a camera in their hands and they are shooting it. The next, all right, is follow cam. So now he's going to look at the character and follow it, like there's a man running next to him as he's shooting the scene. And it runs back. Okay. All right, so we're gonna run back to one more final comparison now with all the Cinemachine stuff added in. So we've got the plain, boring scene where he runs up, punches a guy. This is something you would realistically be showing to someone who's like, hey, I've got this new thing I threw together. Are you interested in working in RPG? Or you could show them this with only 45 minutes of work. You go, hey, yeah, and then it runs back, and now they're really interested in your project and they want to work with you. But this is if you're being reasonable. If you're like me, you want to crank everything up to 100 and you want to just go kind of crazy with it. So this is if you take all the effects and you go way too far with it. So we're going to run back real quick to the first one. Really static, really boring. And then we get dramatic. We start with the close-up of the face to show his determination. Then he runs in. He punches him. He runs back in a cool way. And it shows you the whole scene. It zooms out. And all of this, an hour. I'm not kidding you. Once you've run through this once, you've got it. And it's super easy. And that's it. The slides are all available here. The GitHub repo, you can go get this project and look at it. It's all set up. If you have questions, you can get me on Twitter or email me. Are there any questions? Yes. Yes. That is, I'm so glad you said that. Well, actually, it wasn't a question, and I cut you off. Yeah, so the question was about new HD TVs and running with like a Blu-ray that's running at like 120 frames or 60 frames per second. And is that similar to the chromatic aberration? That's exactly it. Everyone, when they first saw those TVs, like, why does this look weird? You know, why does everything look too smooth? And why am I not liking this? It is exactly the same reason we're adding chromatic aberration and vignetting, because we have all gotten used to a certain feel for our movies and what we expect to see. So when you see something outside of that, even though it's technically better, until we adjust, it doesn't look right to us. Okay, so the question there was, how do you maintain the balance between being a game and also trying to emulate cinematics without going too far? Ideally, you have a really good creative director that knows what vision they're looking for, and they will stop you and go, no, this is not what I'm looking for, we've gone too far. I personally, when I'm working on a project, I haven't hit that wall because I like to go too crazy. I like to add too many effects, and I like to go stylized. So I'm not a good example for that. I'm not a good person to ask that question. Someone else has to tell me to stop, because I will keep going until someone says, don't, no, it's too much. It's too I'm getting sick. Yes. Yes. So the question was, do these effects change when you're working in a virtual reality environment? Some of those effects they don't translate. You can't actually use them. I don't have a good example for which one those are. Some things I can just tell you off the top of my head, like the Cinemachine camera shake that you add to make it look handheld. You wouldn't and can't add that in VR. It would just immediately make someone vomit. I don't have a lot of those. A lot of my coworkers work in VR. I've only done a few projects, so I can't give you some good examples there. Anyone else? Will? One more? Nope. All right. Thank you so much for letting me talk to all of you. I hope you enjoyed it.